Cool, we can get started. The topic obviously is up here, but we're going to dig into how to use InSpec as a native component. I wouldn't say native component, but with native components of Azure, and what that looks like to just audit your machines as they get deployed. The way I like to describe this is plugging in utilities into the fabric so that there's no escape. Like when VMs get deployed, they're going to get scanned. There's no way around it once it's implemented this way. So that'll be our topic. I'm not going to go. I'm going to show InSpec profiles and such, but I'm not going to go into how to use InSpec as much because there's already been at least 6 sessions that covered that in great detail. So I'm going to talk specifically about how to plug this into Azure Policy. I'll introduce myself first. So my name is Michael Green. I have been at Microsoft, it'll be 15 years this September. I've done all kinds of things. I've been in the field. I was a service engineer in O365. I worked in Windows, I worked in PowerShell, and now I work, our team, the PowerShell team, sort of sits as part of Azure now. So I've been around for a long time and done a bunch of things. Currently, what's in focus for me is the configuration management strategy for Microsoft Azure. And my current thinking about this is that we just need to make it so that anybody can use the tool of their choice and make Azure the best platform for using configuration management tools. My first time at ChefConf was in 2014 in Santa Clara. That was sort of a life-changing event for me. I'd been working as a service engineer in the precursor before it became O365 for a few years. So I'd been living and breathing operations for quite a while. And kind of got like this whole configuration as code thing hit me over the head, and I was like, wow, that's amazing. And ended up, Stephen Morawski and I published a white paper on how to make that work with Microsoft technologies. And I think I've only missed maybe one ChefConf since then. So I really enjoy working with this community. My email address is up here. You're welcome to email me with follow-ups, questions, if you'd like to dig into this in more detail, if you want me to fly out and hang out with you while we're setting this up, then feel free to send me an email and we'll get connected. Also, Twitter handle is @migreen. And then, I don't know if anybody has tried this yet, but people are now using Twitch to stream live coding. So Twitch is like the video game streaming service. And it's really neat, but there's now there's a Twitter handle, PowerShell Live, and they send out notifications anytime that somebody on a list is streaming live coding, working on PowerShell projects. I don't know why, but I'm completely addicted to this. Like watching it, I'll occasionally live stream, and I just as a PM, I'll work on side projects, or I've even streamed working on documentation, and people will get in the chat window and say like, oh, maybe you should mention this. And I'm like, this is the coolest thing ever. It's like going to a user group in the middle of the afternoon. So I'm thoroughly addicted to live streaming. And it's going to be really interesting to see what that does for technical communities. Terminology. I just want to kind of pave the foundation here. Whenever I say Azure governance, I'm referring broadly to the umbrella of everything in the realm of Azure governance. We tend to talk about Azure Policy, blueprints, resource graph, but anything that has to do with governance in this broad term, and what you can sort of reconcile that into real world terms. If you are in the role of being responsible for lots and lots of Azure subscriptions, so you may have anywhere from 5 to 10 to hundreds, depending on the size of your organization, and you're giving these out to application teams. And you're just scared to death, right? Because what happens if one of those application teams decides to go ahead and roll out a size M20 or whatever virtual machine, and now the meter starts running, and you get a bill for $100,000, and somebody wants to know what happened. So Azure Policy, which is the second line item on here, is the ability at various levels to assign rules. And they're just guardrails. So you're still enabling application developers to move at their own pace. They're still interacting directly with Azure. But for their subscription, You're setting rules for what they can and can't do. So you can only do VMs of this size. They have to use managed disks. They have to have a tag that says who owns it. The storage account supporting those VMs have to live within this geography, on and on and on. Anything related to Azure Resource Manager. Blueprints take that one step further by saying, as part of subscriptions, we're going to automatically have certain things there. It might even include a per subscription level set of policies. So we could go on and on about that concept. If you go to aka.ms/Azure Policy or azure.com/policy, I think, you can find out lots and lots of information. What we're going to focus in on today is Azure Policy guest configuration. So that's specifically what our engineering team works on. We're the first to extend Azure Policy outside of Azure. Specifically, let's reach into VMs. So what if inside of Azure you could say, application teams go crazy, and if you decide you also need virtual machines, Windows or Linux, we're just going to audit and see if you're following best practices. We're not doing enforcement yet. We plan to, but right now we're focused on audit, which is why InSpec is a really cool thing to plug into this. The idea is, and probably the most common request is for baselines, CIS, STIG, NIS, name your favorite regulation, and there's probably somebody has published templates, InSpec templates, group policy templates, you name it, on a bunch of machine settings that should be applied. That's a super, super common scenario. So you could just say anything that's deployed with a tag, credit card or something has to get audited for SOX compliance or whatever it is. That's the type of scenarios we're talking about here. InSpec, I don't think I have to introduce to this crowd, but we can think about this as a language abstraction for audit. So this is a list of, it's going to be impossible for you to read from your seats, and I'm not going to read through each one, but this is our current list of built-in policies. What these are capabilities that are fully GA now in Azure, where the infrastructure involves a new resource provider and a new extension. And for each of these, I'll kind of read off a couple of examples. These are things that you can just go into the portal and point and click enable that you want to audit these. So let's say at the management group level, across hundreds of subscriptions, maybe there's an application that has a vulnerability and it's particularly dangerous and you want to make sure it's not installed anywhere. One of the policies we have is audit Windows and/or audit Linux for applications that should be there or should not be there. We can check who has administrative privilege. We can check for password policies, things like that. Those are all kind of security-oriented. One of the neat things about plugging operations-focused tools into this, like InSpec and other tools for audit, is you can actually audit for pretty much anything. So we have policies for auditing for certificates that are within 30 days of expiration. Maybe you've had application teams that sort of weren't aware that could be a problem, or they don't know that they need to trust your trusted root certificate authority, or making sure that a DSC configuration is compliant, that PowerShell modules are there, look for machines that are pending reboot, you get the idea. It doesn't have to be a security-focused thing. You could also audit across all of your subscriptions for your operational requirements. Let's see how this one turns up. Okay, that works. So we have right now I'm going to use air quotes, preview, the ability to extend this scenario into custom, meaning you author the configuration and audit for whatever you want. I say air quotes because we tend, like within our engineering group, we tend to talk about, we're going to go through a private preview, which means we engage directly with customers, and then a public preview, which means it's not GA, it's not really supported yet, but it's marked in preview and it's out, and then we go GA, which means it's fully supported. We're sort of in the middle between private preview and public preview. Everything is fully functional, doesn't require a feature flag, doesn't require any sort of whitelisting of your subscription. You just have to know about it. And the only reason I haven't published our docs yet is I'm holding out for a couple more things specifically related to making it easier to troubleshoot from the developer workstation and have that better authoring experience. And then we'll move on to a public preview. So I'm going to walk you through everything that you need to know today to work with the private preview, but if you want to look at this in more detail, then give me a shout and we'll connect and get it set up. So here I have an editor open, and you can see I've got an InSpec profile that's just looking for, is Firewall D installed in Linux, is the daemon running, and is the default zone set to, and then it's accepting an attribute with the default being public. So I now have a InSpec profile that's going to go audit Linux machines, and it's going to make sure that this specific firewall package is installed and that the zone is set correctly. How would I use this with policy? I now have an arrow pointing to the describe block. This is an example of a policy that you can use in Azure, and I'll show you what this looks like from the portal as well, and we'll do a little bit of live demo. Policy, so Azure is just working with ARM, or sorry, Azure Policy is just working with ARM, or Azure Resource Manager, which is the API. So you can imagine a new deployment's coming in. It's just going to look at the deployments and look for things that are or are not supposed to be there. And then it has policy effects like audit, so that just make sure that you're aware of it. Deny, so don't actually allow a deployment if it has certain things. Or in our case, deploy if not exists, which means if they deploy a VM, or if your application team deploys a VM and it doesn't have an extension that allows you to perform an audit, add it. So deploy if not exist is just saying at the time when you assign it, you're creating a managed service identity that has permissions to do that deployment. If anybody deploys into this subscription that doesn't have the agent required for doing an audit, then go ahead and put it there. It's an if-then syntax. So if I were to scroll up on this page, you would see if. It's identifying the type virtual machine. It's looking for different image publishers so that we can detect the operating system. And then you see maybe from the back of the room at the top of the screen, the effect is deploy if not exists. And you'll see what we're actually looking for is Microsoft.guest configuration assignments. So we can start here. Microsoft.guest configuration is the name of our resource within Azure. The way that you can think about this, if I would go down here to guest configuration content URI, I'm going to show you later, but this is pointing out to a package that's sitting somewhere. So it's just a zip file with all the contents that you need. And you can see Microsoft.compute/virtual machine/providers/guest configuration assignments. So what we're really saying is draw a connection between the package that has your InSpec profiles and a virtual machine and map that out at the API level, because guest configuration is a provider for Microsoft.compute. Here's a less complicated way to think about that. The scenario that you want to audit is the firewall enabled. You've now described that natively in the Azure API. Is the firewall enabled? Is something that I want to audit? This policy is just drawing a connection and saying, for this virtual machine, that scenario matters, and matching them up. So now whenever the agent gets deployed, it's going to query back to the resource provider in Azure and say, what are the things I'm supposed to be going and looking for? And it's going to say, you're supposed to be looking for is the firewall enabled. And then it audits, it returns a status. That's where you're seeing Microsoft.guest configuration/guest configuration assignments, firewall D enabled. This gets associated with the second policy where you see the audit.json. That's literally just looking at that assignment to see what status the agent returned. So big picture, what's actually happening here, it's adding an agent in the VM that's running that InSpec profile, returning that as a status to the provider. Now, is the firewall enabled? Is a property of that virtual machine. So Microsoft.compute has a provider for guest configuration assignment with name Firewall D enabled that has a status compliant, status is compliance or not compliant. So that means now the idea is it's part of a virtual machine. So if this is something like CIS profile, or is the machine domain joined, or does it have an application installed, or something like that, you're now describing whole scenarios in Azure Resource Manager connected out to a package that's saying this is a property of the virtual machine through that guest configuration provider. It should be joined to a domain, it should have a firewall turned on, its password policies should be meeting our standard, and it should have these applications installed. Part of that if statement can also include, well, it can include whatever you want, right? So it could be go look for machines with a tag, go look for machines that match a certain name, however you want to audit. So basically any scenario that you want to connect with the virtual machine based on any criteria is something that you can work with. I didn't use my animations. Okay, so what does this look like before we kind of walk through the experience and get into the nitty-gritty? Azure Policy is just part of Azure Resource Manager, so once you make this assignment, there's no getting out of it, right? Other tools tend to work through like registering an application ID, which assumes that you know of all the subscriptions and that you can go work across all these subscriptions. If you apply this to the management group level, any subscriptions in scope are going to get audited. Azure Policy guest configuration is based on a new version of PowerShell desired state configuration. Meaning, so if you think about the point of PowerShell, I'm also the PM for PowerShell DSC. PowerShell DSC in the context that it exists today, version 1, is focused on having a common configuration management platform for Windows that can be used by itself or together with Chef, Puppet, Ansible, you name it. New iteration of DSC, completely rewritten based on all of the feedback we've had and user voice and you name it. So far is only implemented as part of Azure Solutions, and it's implemented sort of at the Azure platform level. So it's not even surfaced into Azure DSC and things like that yet. We'll get there. This iteration is based on the idea that can we standardize what we call the data plane, so the transfer of information and the execution of tools so that we can take any tool you want and plug it in and get results back into reporting. So whether you want to use InSpec, if you want to use your own homegrown tool, if you want to use like a cookbook to go just audit the current state of the machine and return the results, anything that we can capture standard out, we can build a resource for it, execute it, return it, and report on it. If you're familiar with DSC, DSC has a context of get, set, and test. Test to see if it's in the right state. Get returns the current state, and set puts it in the right state. In this case, for audit, we're running test. If test fails, we run get to see what the current state is, and that's what we report on. So the way we've packaged this, you can really use any tool you want. It just so happens that for Linux machines, our native provider is Chef InSpec. Based on feedback, we're going to open the door just through, and then allow it to use PowerShell Core so that you can write whatever provider you want. But right now, if you want to use custom content for auditing Linux, actually the only language that we support is Chef InSpec. For Windows, it is PowerShell DSC, at least based on the DSC syntax. It is DSC, but I describe it as a DSC syntax. Now that we support custom content, you can also create your own modules, and you can really use whatever you want. It is running inside the VM, so we're not doing anything like a Bastion host to go remotely audit machines and things like that. But we do have a lot of controls in place to make sure that when this runs, even if you have an error or something going on in your custom resource or your audit or in your profile, it's never going to consume more than a certain percentage of memory, processor, you name it. So I've talked about custom content already. Within the Azure portal, this is what this looks like. So you would go from the Azure homepage to all settings, search for policy, and whenever you click on the policy, you're going to land on this page. For compliance, you can see as an example of having one of the built-in policies assigned, I've got require audit D and firewall D on all Linux VMs. You can see I've got 19 non-compliant VMs, that about everything that's in scope. So this is just built in. The nice thing about integrating this at this level is whether it's auditing inside the VM or network requirements or storage requirements or you name it, you can do all of it from one place. You can look completely across both ARM and inside the VM from one point of view. Whenever you go do your assignments, so if you work through the policy page and you go to assignments, new, you can set the scope however you want, management group, subscription, resource group. You can do exclusions, so if you wanted to leave out specific VMs, you can, and of course you can do all of this through PowerShell or Azure CLI as well. Whenever you get to, I can't read the screen very well, so you probably can't either. Whenever you get to picking the definition that you're going to assign, the one thing that I would point out, right now, because we require both the audit and the deploy if not exists, we roll that up into what's called a policy initiative, which is just a group of definitions. Make sure that you assign the initiative, so that way you get all of the requirements. If you just apply the audit policy, it's just going to stay at 0 of 0 resources forever because the agent's never going to get deployed to that VM. This is what the package actually looks like. So if on the top left-hand corner, you can see I've downloaded the zip file for Windows Firewall enabled. You can see it's got a moth file that you would expect to see for DSC and a modules folder. Down in the bottom left-hand corner under modules, you can see we've got our guest configuration and native DSC resources. I also have one here for GC InSpec, guest configuration InSpec. Which is just a custom module that we're working on that I'll show here in just a minute. And then Windows Firewall enabled is just the InSpec profiles. If I drill into Windows Firewall enabled profiles, you can see my controls folder and my InSpec YAML. And then if I go one step deeper, if I go to the guest config or GC InSpec folder, you can see the current iteration of the PowerShell module to make that work. A couple of things that I wanted to show is our tooling. So this is what we're working on to get the developer experience. Obviously, this text is way too small for you to read from the back of the room, but the things that we're working on, so there's in the PowerShell gallery right now a package called guest configuration. And the core set of commandlets here are new package, new policy, and publish policy. So the idea is I want to take my InSpec profiles, the custom module to allow them to be executed, and create a content package out of that, and then publish that into either it could be blob storage, it could be blob storage with a private SAS token so that nobody else can access it. It could be a GitHub release, it could be a GitHub project. Anywhere that the machine can access, you can stage this zip file. If you wanted to put it into an Artifactory feed, if you want to put it into, like I said, anywhere that the zip file can be reached and downloaded, it will then pass that into the new policy commandlet, and that will completely scaffold out the project for you. So that will create, like that JSON template that I had open earlier with a deploy if not exists. You don't have to write any of that. The new policy, new guest configuration policy will create all of that for you based on the template. And it will fill out, so one of the cool things that we just added based on a customer onsite that we did, and this is actually really interesting for InSpec, we can pass parameters in at deployment time of the assignment. So we probably saw earlier, like if you're doing an assignment and you're saying audit for these applications, or in the profile that I showed, I mentioned that there was an attribute for what zone should be active for the local firewall. Now with InSpec, you would write that to your attributes file. Basically, for the built-in provider that we have right now for Linux, it just dynamically creates that YAML file on the fly. So whenever you do an assignment, you have that built-in parameter for these are the applications I want to look for. At runtime, it's creating that YAML file and then executing InSpec. That becomes really interesting because now the attributes that you want to audit are just parameters that are being passed into ARM at the time that you make that assignment. So you're still managing those parameters as, like just the way you were before as attributes, you're still managing them as code in source control, but you can actually manage that in your deployment code by having a parameters file for your ARM deployment, and you don't have to manage it as an attributes file. It's all gonna get created dynamically. Our latest, and this actually won't show up yet if you do a deployment. Boy, that white box really lit up the room. This is our latest based on an onsite that we did just a couple of weeks ago. Whenever you get the results back for the policy, on an item-by-item basis for things that you've been auditing, we pass back the reasons why it's out of compliance. So it's not, if you say I want to audit for applications that should be installed, it's insufficient to say it's out of compliance. you have to know, if you give it a list of 5 applications, you have to know which of those applications are actually out of compliance. So we were returning the reasons information as a specific reasons phrase that was returned by InSpec, and the customer said, well, you know, it'd be nice is if I look at the outputs and I just saw what I would get if I were to look at the native InSpec output. So that's exactly what we're doing. Whenever you go into the reports going forward, if it's based on InSpec, you'll actually see the full fidelity InSpec outputs right there in the Azure portal and be able to understand exactly what's in and out of compliance. All right, so at this point, I'm going to switch over and show a couple of things. I haven't actually checked in my latest version yet, so this is going to change a little bit, but it is marked beta, so that's okay. I was doing a lot of work on this afternoon. But this is a GC InSpec repo. Why did it not? Oh, it's because it's extending instead of mirroring. That's what I wanted you to do, was that thing. There we go. That's better. OK. So this repo has been a collaboration that Trevor Hess, who works at Chef, awesome guy, and I have been talking about doing for a long time, and finally got some time to spend on working on this. He and I are both the admins for this project, so we're going to co-maintain it. And the idea is to have a community-supported module for InSpec to use in policy, because right now it's implemented for Linux, and one of the requests that's been coming since Ignite last year from the Chef booth is, when are you going to do InSpec for Windows inside of Azure Policy? So this module makes that work. And you can see right now it's marked as private. We are going to change that. I'm in the danger zone. So starting right now, of course, and it's probably going to try to text message me or, with a code. Hey, it worked. OK, cool. So starting right now, this project is public. I will check in my latest changes from literally what I was working on an hour ago in the back of the room when the session is over. But this will be an active project as we go through beta and then making it available. But using custom content, this will allow you to audit Windows machines using Chef InSpec the same way that we're doing for Linux machines now. It's just a DSC resource. I recently, just earlier today, switched it from being a class-based resource over to a script-based resource, just to iron out a couple of things. But ultimately, I want to switch it back to being a class-based resource. That's kind of how I prefer to do it. If you want to see exactly how this works, so across the functions, there's a function to go get and see what version of InSpec is installed. There's a function to actually download the most recent version of InSpec and handle the install. There's a function for invoking InSpec and writing out, both in JSON and a text file for the raw CLI output, what the results were. And then there's a function for converting from that JSON file over into a PowerShell object. And then at the bottom, we should see the DSC. So there's get target resource. Did I scroll too far? I would expect to see. No? OK. So get-target resource is just taking the name of the InSpec profile and the version of InSpec that you expect to see, and just calling those functions. So first, let's make sure that InSpec is installed. If it's not, install it. And then where do these files live that should be outputs by running InSpec? And then where do the files end up that need to be converted? And then return that information. And then once that information is returned, that's what feeds it back into policy. So really all this is doing is making sure it's there, that it's the right version, running it, and then taking that output and passing it back up into policy so that it can be included in the reports. Test target resource, if you're not familiar with DSC, Pretty straightforward on this one. Man, that text is small. Let's see if I do. Nope, too big. Nah, that's reasonable. This is just calling get, and based on the reasons information that came back, if it's null or if there is a reason that it's out of compliance, then return, basically fail the test in InSpec language. Otherwise, assume that it's good. And then set, I mentioned earlier that policy is not currently doing enforcement, so set just says this should never have been called and throws an error. So that's how the actual module works. And we'll see if the test that I kicked off before we started worked or not. So we have two sets of commandlets that are of interest. I mentioned the guest configuration. It's still pending. That means that something went wrong. I mentioned there's the guest configuration package in the PowerShell gallery. There's also az.guest configuration. And that gives you this nice commandlet where you can go out and call for a specific resource group, for a specific VM, what's its current compliance status. And then once I finish this up, it'll also write that InSpec output for the compliance reasons. And this is nice because it also has a command for get-azvm guest policy status history. So if you want to say for that VM, here's a set of InSpec tests that should be run. It's going to be run every 15 minutes, although that's configurable. You can make it run whatever interval you want. Show me for every 15 minutes, or the life of that VM, or however often you want to run it, what the results were. So if an auditor says, can you prove to me it's always been in that state? Sure. And then it also has a parameter for only show when it changed. So rather than flood your cache with hundreds and hundreds of rows about the status of the machine, it can give you just the 2 or 3 rows where it was compliant, and then somebody disabled the firewall service, and it went not compliant, and then when it came back. So that's really handy because whenever we start getting into outages or dealing with problems or dealing with a machine that had a problem last week, and somebody says, what state was it in last week? Well, it's too late to check now. You have to have that information somewhere. So this is a really nice tool from that regard. So before we go over to Q&A, it's interesting to think about the intersections here. So why would you want to run InSpec using Azure Policy versus just running InSpec, period? I like that whenever you assign it, whether it's at the resource group level, the subscription level, the management group level, whatever makes sense to you, there's no getting out of it. So regardless of whether or not you've set up anything special, or if somebody deploys and they try to create some sort of a workaround to be evasive, any resource of type virtual machine that gets deployed within that scope is automatically going to get audited. You're still managing InSpec as code. So in your project, you're still going to have your profile checked in where you deploy your Azure Policy. You're rolling up your attributes into parameters for your Azure assignment. So it's still being managed as code, but you're keeping track of the specific environmental data as part of your deployment as opposed to just as part of your profile. So if you wanted to have a different set of values that you look for based on an assignment that's going to a test subscription versus a prod subscription or something like that, you can literally make that part of deploying your assignments as code, as opposed to having to maintain separate attribute files for each of those environments. One of the next things, and I've got this in the README for the repo that we want to start looking at, and Trevor and I have been talking about this for months as well. There's really no reason why Automate couldn't call the guest configuration API to get these results and report on it there as well. So if you want like the full end-to-end loop, it would be where you take your InSpec profiles, you package them up and put them in a storage account or GitHub or wherever you want to put them, Artifactory, doesn't matter. You assign a policy to a scope that says any machines that get deployed that meet these criteria, automatically audit them with InSpec. Those results are going to get returned back with the full InSpec outputs through the Azure API for Microsoft.guest configuration, Automate can just call that. It's just a REST endpoint, right? And at that point, I think it's in, I don't know if it's out of beta or not, but the integration with Azure from Automate to have it go look for things like CIS, best practices in Azure. Automate should easily be able to go get the information from guest configuration API. So now you've got full circle. You've got full integration. So that'll be what we work on next as part of this project. And that's my last slide. Yes, sir? You could do it that way. I tend to answer a lot of software questions that way, though. So the question, if I unravel it a little bit, an assignment is just a JSON file that you're running as a deployment for Azure. And Automate knows how to do Azure deployments. So if you wanted to manage your assignments through Terraform, through Automate, through any platform, through using Chef, like any platform that you want that can do Azure deployments, can ultimately manage your policy assignments as well. So you could even, like that's a great point, you could do full circle, which is Automate does your assignments, which uses InSpec as part of Azure Policy and gets the results back out and still view it in Automate. So you could 100% draw a complete lifecycle circle. That'd be actually a really cool demo for next year. Yeah, hi. Yes. Yep. So I'll show you two ways. I'll show you as code, and I'll show you from the portal. If you're interested in doing this, let's do this first so that maybe it'll help. They changed where the color scheme is. Brighten this up a little bit. And then maybe one less. Cool. If you come in here to Azure Policy and you click on Definitions, there's two drop-down filters that will make your life a lot easier. The first is change this to Initiative, because that will group everything and make it much easier to see. The second is uncheck Select All for Category and only choose Guest Configuration. You get the idea, right? There's policies for everything in Azure. But if you look specifically at Guest Configuration and then expand this column, and we get this out of the way, now we're looking at all these different initiatives. So let's find something interesting. Let's say this is auditing for TLS, use of TLS 1.2 in IIS. So if I click on Assign, I just give it a scope. And I've got access to a whole bunch of subscriptions, but let's say 70. And then I could pick a resource group, but I know that this is an empty subscription, so I'm going to do subscription-wide. And if I had specific resources I want to exclude, I could do that here. And then I like to customize these. So for the assignment name, this is like an on or off policy, so it's not very exciting. But if it was something like audit installed applications, I change the assignment name to reflect what applications I'm actually auditing. And then you just click Assign. You're going to see two notification bubbles. One is the assignment deployment. The second is creating the role assignment. And here is, I've got this link in the deck, I believe, but if not, if you go to github.com/Microsoft/RFC, request for comments, _ custom guest config. This is my fully public project documenting all the details of our private preview. So this talks about exactly what are we planning to support, our user story for who we have in mind, what we're proposing as a solution. And then I have a live build, which you could clone and use for your own testing. In fact, that's how I'm testing the module itself. And within this build file, I'm using all those commandlets that I mentioned earlier. So this is set up as a public build. You can see the results in Azure DevOps. but I'm going through and running PowerShell script analyzer to make sure everything looks good. I'm creating those MOF files on the fly. I'm creating the artifacts by using that commandlet new guest configuration package. And then I publish it to a storage account and get the SAS token. And then I'm using new guest configuration policy. And here's where I mentioned if you want to take something like the information that normally would go into attributes file and dynamically work with that, we actually make it easy. You just create a hash table of where that's at in the MOF file that gets compiled. And so this, whenever it scaffolds out the project for you, this takes care of creating all of the parameters automatically so that you don't have to do anything. So there's an example here of how to do that. And then you can see where it gets published. And then specific to your question, in this case, I actually just have an Azure deployment for a JSON file. And that's a very short deployment. It's just creating that assignment. And then the last step is what I want to make sure you're aware of. So you can see after the assignment gets created, I've got a sleep timer for 30 seconds just to make sure that it's replicated all the way around the world and the Azure Active Directory has picked it up. And then I do a separate deployment for the role assignment. So I bring that up because if you do this from code, that's something to be aware of. So I mentioned if you do it from the portal, you hit assign, you see notification, the deployment was successful for the assignment. Notification, the deployment was successful for the role assignment. The role assignment is the managed service identity that says, from this point forward, any VM that gets deployed is going to get that agent and it's going to get audited. Well, something in that automation has to have permission to go put that agent on the VM, and that's the role assignment that gets created here. So I just do the same thing as code that you saw in the portal before. Any other questions? You made it to 6 p.m. on Thursday. Who's ready to go listen to some music and drink some beer and hang out? And woo! What's that? You're right. It's 6 p.m. on Wednesday. Yeah. Yeah. That's how long of a week I've had. This one. So I have two repos that I showed. The first was GitHub. They're both github.com/Microsoft. The first was GC InSpec, guest configuration InSpec. The second was RFC, for request for comments, _ custom guest config. And if the link wasn't in the slides, I didn't see it, then I will add it and upload a new version.
Will we be able to get a slide deck?
As far as I know, yes. If not, then I don't know why I uploaded it. Cool. Thank you very much. I appreciate you staying the whole time. It's great.